Alright, this video is about everything you need to know or ever wanted to know about color in Photoshop. So obviously first I'd create new, and this is where we have our first important choice. What is happening? Okay, there it goes. So we have this color mode down here, and generally we're going to select between RGB and CMYK. RGB, as you saw from the video, is able to reproduce more colors. The place to use it is for screen graphics or something where you don't want to get rid of color information. So your digital camera photographs in RGB color, although they're going to be printed sometimes. So I don't know if you've ever experienced it where your photo looks really bright on the screen, and then when it prints it looks a little duller. That's the conversion from RGB to CMYK. So if you want to set up something for print, you want to start in the CMYK color space. That way you don't accidentally select colors that are out of gamut, as you saw in the video, right? That means colors that can't be reproduced in CMYK that can be reproduced in RGB color. So I'm going to leave it in RGB color mode just so we have everything. Actually, you know what? I'm going to switch to CMYK color just so I can show that out of gamut thing. And I'm going to say create. Okay, so colors in Photoshop. What can we do? Well, first notice down here at the bottom left, right, we've already discussed this, our foreground and background colors. So if I click this, I've got my foreground. I can click on this one, have a different background. I don't know why I would, but right there. Usually I just, sometimes if I'm working between two colors, I set them so I can just flip them back and forth. Other things you can do with the keyboard, D goes back to the default colors, X on your keyboard switches between the colors. Okay, so next thing we want to talk about is the color palette. So right now you may not have, yeah, I guess you'll see what this is. It really depends on how you have it set up. But over here we have our color thing, and we can select the colors just the same as we can select the colors down here, right? There's no real difference. Just a little bit different way of getting colors. Another thing we can do on either of these swatches, right, is just double click, right? And so we're in here. And this is where we have all of our really valuable things. We're probably not going to use HSB or lab colors in this, but RGB, you might find a color online and you get the RGB values, so you could type those in individually, right? So if I said 155, I get into this color space. This is the hexadecimal color, especially for the web. This is super great to use because it's just one place. So hexadecimal colors always start with the hashtag, and then they have some 6-number and letter combination. You know, again, if you take my web class, I go a little deeper into color and the web. So I'm going to say just okay for right now, and I have that. Other things available for you in Photoshop is there's the Swatches palette. So the swatch palette is loaded with lots of different colors that you can grab. You can actually load different types of swatches. So what I did was I clicked on this hamburger right here, and you see, well, some of these are like this Pantone is, you saw in the video, spot colors. So Pantone is a spot color. If I click on that, you'd say, I'm just going to append it to the bottom here, and you notice all the colors from spot colors in here. I generally don't use spot colors in a Photoshop thing, especially CMYK. Really only use spot colors in InDesign or Illustrator. So something that handles more vectory type things. I generally wouldn't use spot colors in a Photoshop file. But that's just to tell you that it's there. So obviously, how do we fill with colors? We've got our main tools. Well, obviously we can use brushes and everything else, but our main tools are this gradient tool and paint bucket tool. We've seen the paint bucket tool, right? I can just go ahead and fill the entire area with the paint bucket tool. But we have this gradient tool. And this gradient tool will allow us, right? A gradient is going between colors in a way that slowly interpolates them, I guess is the best word. So if I put this down, you'll see the first one is always going to be the foreground to background color. So if I change this foreground color to something like, well, let's make it obvious, right? This color, see, my foreground color is there. The next one is always going to be your foreground color to transparent. And then there's all these other ones, and you can load them. But what we really want to do is go into a gradient editor. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that. So if you notice what I clicked on, I cancel again. I just clicked on this right here. And I can actually custom make my gradient. So let's look at this and how to make a gradient. So you have these things called stops, and that means like your main colors for it to interpolate between. So if I select this one, right, I have this one selected, I can change this color to say, I'm going to make it a blue color. Now here's our out of gamut. If I'm working in CMYK and it's out of gamut, I'm going to click that to get the next color closest to gamut to that color, so I'll do that and hit OK. Now this other one over here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to pick white. And notice that I can see my checkerboards through here. That's because this one, the top things that are across the top from these are actually the opacity. So if I click this one, you see the opacity here is 63%. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a full color, right? So this goes from this color blue to this color white. I'm going to hit OK. I've got my gradient tool obviously selected, and I can draw it out like that. And then anytime I do this, it'll just redraw the entire layer's gradient or your selection's gradient. You can have different modes. This right now is just a linear gradient, but we can make it radial. So I clicked up here and I selected radial. And then there's these other ones that, well, this is the only other, this is a reflected linear. That's useful at times. These other two are garbage. I never use them. I don't see a purpose for those. Maybe you'll find a purpose for those. This one's even worse, this like starburst one. Ugh. Anyhow, as far as advice on using gradients, never use a complete black to white gradient. Unless you have a really specific reason to. Reason for that is we'll talk about type, contrast, and things like that. It's hard to have type that can span from black to white. Black to white gradients, new students like to use these all the time, but they are absolute garbage. If anything, what you'd want to do is maybe make it a more gentle type of gradient. So what I might do is go to gray. So I'm going to put another thing here. I hate the way Photoshop has changed this. You see it like grabbed my foreground color. I don't want that at all. So I'm going to go in and get this to cancel. I'm going to actually have this selected, and I'm going to swap these around. See, now notice I can swap these around, and I'm going to select this one and just grab that. And now I can remove a stop by simply grabbing it and dragging it out. So here I have, and notice you didn't have opacities for each of these. Opacities only happen in the beginning and stops. But now I have a nice gentle gradient, and I would suggest always using a gentle gradient when you're going to use gradients. It will make everything look more professional rather than these crazy gradients. Another trick I do with gradients all the time is actually use the radial gradient. Whoops, I'm going to need to flip these. So can we invert this? I'm just going to go ahead and invert it by dragging these. The Illustrator's much better at gradients. And do something like this. Well, I'm going to drag it even further. So notice like the darker edges, and this feels more like a spotlight effect. I find that to be something that's way better for using gradients. We don't have to use this gradient tool, and the thing is about this, we'd always have to redraw it. We can actually use these adjustment layers, that's what they're called. So if I select gradient, the nice thing about this is, right, I have this gradient here and I can futz with it, okay. I decide I don't like it later, I just double click on this and I'm able to go ahead and like, ooh, I'm going to change it to, obviously, do not use this. But I was just showing you that I can easily change this and there's no penalty, right? I can just go ahead, do this, I can reverse it, I can play with the scale of the gradient, right? So that's not so bad. Because this is more of an analogous color scheme that it's going between. I like that. I can swap it to radial, right? Different things. So these are the ways to work with color and gradients in Photoshop. There's not much else I can tell you about these things. Obviously, also, just like this, we can fill with and we've seen this already in this class, so a solid color, right? And then the nice thing about that is we can go ahead and grab it and change that color at will. And so that's everything you really need to know about working with color in Photoshop.